Uh, Welcome everybody to the webinar, the third webinar in the series, the ISOP series on QSP, where we try to discuss bridging and tackling of the gap between empirical and systems pharmacology models. Where do we stand? And today we'll talk about good practices in model-informed drug discovery and development. And I will try to highlight on behalf of the FP uh, working group, what model-informed drug discovery and development good practices will mean. So the intent of the modeling and simulation workshop about 5 years ago was to discuss the role and the scope of modeling and simulation in drug development, both from a developer, a drug industry, as well as the regulator perspective, with the aim to learn from each other, but also to see if there's any gap or opportunity. This has been summarized in a number of papers that were published in early 2013. And I'll briefly show you the gaps and opportunities that we identified at that moment, as well as what has been progress that has been made. So first of all, we identified a challenge essentially that model-informed drug development was underutilized and undervalued in pharma. Communications between modelers and non-modelers is not always optimal. So we try to address that in the white paper that I will come back to. But also from a regulatory perspective, the heterogeneity in reporting is one of the key challenges that the regulators have seen, where we wanted to provide some idea about good practices from the industry partners. But a number of other initiatives and gaps have been addressed, and that is the formation of the Modeling and Simulation Working Group at the EMA, and they have published a number of activities reports over the years, and including 2016, which is not linked here. There's also an initiative, and that's the DD More initiative that now has transformed into the foundation, which tries to strengthen the data sharing initiatives, as well as the EMA initiative of sharing clinical trial data. So a lot of progress has been made. Today we'll discuss the good practice documents. So the white paper that was published early last year is essentially the collection of the ideas of 11 companies within FPIA, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry Associates. And we have been trying to compile our thinking in the good practice domain. But also while we were working on that, we also realized that we wanted to promote model-informed drug discovery and development and explain what we mean with that through illustrative examples, how to use it, the impact, and the value. The links to those documents are provided here, and they also will be provided at the ISOP webpage momentarily after the webinar. And this has been in close interaction with people from the EMA as well. So what do we mean with model-informed drug discovery and development? We are aiming to construct a quantitative framework. So obviously, we would like to have develop a drug that has enough efficacy and limited safety or enough tolerability that it will be providing a meaningful difference to the patient. So trying to understand the drug exposure response relationships to be able to pick the right dose is obviously very important and has been the primary domain of our community. But it's not only about that, it's also about being able to pick the right molecule by understanding what are the key properties in the molecule that we need to have in order to get an optimal exposure response relationships, and the biological hypothesis, the target that we are trying to modify, or the combination of targets, and the understanding of how this target behaves in the pathway. Eventually, the drug also needs to be meeting an unmet medical need, or alternatively be differentiable for the patient. So it's going to be an improvement for the patient. It doesn't mean that we have to create this in a linear fashion from left to right. It is something that we like to understand the emerging data with respect to, does that provide additional evidence on the pathway, on the target, on the drug, on the benefit risk ratio, or as well as on the effectiveness and the potential for differentiation during the life cycle of a molecule. And it's about kind of having that iteration, and that will be addressed in the next few slides as well. So model-informed drug discovery and development tries to understand the difference, both the pathway, the disease, the target, the molecule, and the patient populations along the number of questions that you may have during the life cycle. And this, in a definition, we have put it after a long debate into that MID3 is a quantitative framework for the prediction and extrapolation, which is essentially based on the knowledge and the inference that can be generated from the data or models that are formed based on data on the compound, on the mechanism, and the disease. And by doing that, we hope to improve the quality, the efficiency, and the cost effectiveness of the decision making. And technology has been an evolution from modeling and simulation as a very wide term, the more specific terms in systems pharmacology, pharmacometrics, and model-based drug development. And I think the community has moved already at some point in time into from model-based into model-informed drug development. But we made a deliberate effort to include also drug discovery, because trying to understand the disease, the target, or the mechanism itself as well is something that comes in from a very early stage, and being able to pick the right molecule to move that forward is important in the framework and in generating that quantitative framework. So going back to the white paper, this white paper on MID3 has 3 different sections. There's a section on why it is important, and that is primarily aimed at the decision makers, trying to describe the value, the business value, by adhering to a more quantitative strategic approach. Also, we try to summarize what does it mean for practitioners, even for people who are new to the field. Can we make a holistic view of what do we mean with the different methodologies? What do we mean with the different questions? And how can that help the practitioner to get a strategic model-informed drug discovery and development approach in place? And obviously, and that was the key question from the EMA, how should we document that? And we also provide a number of recommendations how we think we should have both the planning and the reporting and the verification of the modeling and simulation activities. So why would MID3 be important for decision making? As I already alluded to, what we generate in our community through the modeling, and those are based, and the modeling is based on both the pathology, physiology, and the pharmacology. We try to generate knowledge based on data that are on the disease level, the mechanistic level, and the compound level. And based on that knowledge, we try to make an inference or a prediction, a simulation that helps us to make a decision. But that can be followed again by generating new data, for example, in the next clinical trial, to confirm that assumption that was made or the prediction that was made based on the prior knowledge. So it will be an iterative cycle, the learning and confirming paradigm that was already long time ago proposed by Dr. Scheiner. But what we will do, if we carry this learning and confirming cycle forward in a quantitative manner, we will be able to inform R&D questions and decision both at the project and the portfolio level. So also being able to address at the disease level or at the therapeutic area level. We'll be able to translate more our information back and forward between species, between healthy and patients. And also, given that it's an accumulative process, the acceptance of both the industry and the regulatory decision makers are, at least we hope to get a better understanding and acceptance. And it can, and it has been documented, obviously increased confidence if we do that is very hard to quantify, but cost savings and cost avoidances have been documented at a number of places. But we also think we can gain increased efficiency of the drug development cycle. What are the questions that we typically try to address? And here's a snapshot of a number of questions. For example, what is the exposure-response relationship for a particular endpoint over time? Can we actually make this drug more tolerable if we titrate? Is there what are the covariates that influence drug exposure or drug efficacy? Is there an optimum between safety and efficacy? How should we use it in different patients? Are there mechanistic background or physiological reasons why patients may respond differently? What is the variability and uncertainty in biomarkers? How can we extrapolate from early markers to late markers? And can we optimize the trial design based on prior knowledge by, for example, reducing the trial size or including comparator arms? And we have exemplified actually in all those questions very generic questions that each program may have into 7 different themes. Those are, for example, the commercial viability or the medical need. So for example, if you don't have a treatment yet, the medical need may be high, or if there's many options already out there, what would be a commercial viable option to bring an additional compound to the market? Many questions on pharmacokinetics, the intrinsic, extrinsic factors, for example, efficacy, safety, tolerability, and then the incorporation into the benefit-risk ratio, but also clinical viability. So can we develop this compound, even though we have a good hypothesis, we have an idea, and we have a good molecule, do we have enough of the markers in place to be able to support that? And the 7th theme is around the study design. But we can have those questions not only on the compound level, but obviously as well on the disease level and the mechanistic level. So we think about getting back to that pathway and the target as well. So it's not only about the compound, but how does that compound work in the biological system? An important piece is as well, in order to address those key questions, we need to have tools to be able to answer those. And as you are aware of, there are many different modeling and simulation tools, many of the empirical dose or time response analyses, more exposure response analyses, that has evolved also into semi-mechanistic modeling. But more newer areas are the model-based meta-analysis areas, as well as the systems pharmacology and the PBPK area. And all those modeling approaches, they are different in their way of applying, also how you would use them and why you would use them. And they have a different requirement in terms of data sources, how you test your assumptions, and how do you qualify those models. And we have tried to summarize that in order to give the reader an overview into in table 2 of the white paper, where we have summarized the different modeling approaches, provided a number of links to tutorials and white papers for further reading. But more importantly, actually also, so how do we view those tools in the decision making, both internally in the pharma companies, where a number of those have been established, and we provide some examples. But in regulatory assessment, for example, the systems pharmacology and PBPK is more emerging, as well as the model-based meta-analyses. Those have not yet been often reported in the public domain. But also, if you think about what can you do, can you extrapolate beyond the available data? Empirical models will have a limited potential, whereas the more mechanistic approaches may have a larger potential, provided you have a sufficient way of exploring the uncertainty and the sensitivity. We have also tried to exemplify the application of model-informed drug discovery and development in the public domain. So we have summarized about 100 case studies across the early discovery, lead generation, all the way to the late development, approval phase, and lifecycle management. And if you look at the gray rectangles, you will see that you have a number of examples for each of those application areas where we have tried to summarize, for example, the study design or the risk-benefit characterization or the patient population selection. And some of those target or mechanistic understanding is something that's done in the very early phases of the program, but also can be done during clinical development when clinical data will come in to inform that. But obviously, the patient population selection is not something that is often done in the very early stages, but more towards the later clinical development and life cycle management. And we've tried to summarize that and not making an exhaustive list of each of those applications, but rather exemplify that so people will have inspiration to see, oh, how has that been done if I run into a specific problem, and being able to identify examples or inspiration. So what are those applications? And obviously, if we think about the regulatory interaction and the regulatory decision making, many of the modeling and simulation activities focus on the dose and schedule selection, understanding the intrinsic and extrinsic factors, and also is there any need for dose adjustments in subpopulations. Assessing QT liability or understanding the differentiation potential or benefit risk, that are also activities that may end up in the regulatory decision-making process. But a lot of the other applications, like how do you extrapolate from healthy volunteers to patients, or how do you project based on preclinical data your first in human dose, or how do you differentiate between the different candidates and optimize your lead optimization program, that is something that is not often seen by the regulator. And that may also not be needed, but a number of those activities will actually, by the end of the day, when the molecule is moving forward and get to regulatory decision making, a foundation on which a number of decisions internally in the company have been made. What is an important aspect is the impact assessment. So what is the impact of the activities that we do? And at the modeling and simulation workshop in 2011, the EMA proposed 3 levels of impact. High impact, where modeling and simulation activities were to replace the evidence base. So, for example, you extrapolate into a pediatric populations and you approve the dose is approved for the pediatric populations without having to run a pediatric trial. Medium impact would be where modeling and simulation is to justify the evidence base, so integrating that information and potentially interpolating. And low impact work would be where you have the modeling and simulation is describing the evidence, but not necessarily outside the observations. And the proposal from the EMA was then that both scientific advice and the documentation and the scrutiny could have a potential relationship to the level of impact. And the MID3 working group also has proposed in a similar way of thinking for the internal decision making, where low category impact, again, from the FPIA members would be to describe the data, and where the description has limited impact on the decision making itself. Medium impact, where you would have an inference, which is part of the decision making, where it's adding additional value. And replace, again, is where the modeling and simulation activities indeed will be the primary point on which the decision making is made. And that will actually, if you are classifying that in that particular way, help to understand what is the risk that you are taking if you look at that evidence that is generated through modeling and simulation, how you should value that, or how the scrutiny of the exploration of, for example, your sensitivity analysis should be. But we would like to stress still that low impact work does not mean that it's low value. You need to have a lot of those low impact activities will essentially be building stones in order to get to the high category impact, or over time evolve in that way. So it is not a static thing, but we hope to have that dialogue to be more transparent in understanding the need for scrutiny. The next example is the Excel sheet. So the summary, I already spoke about the impact examples that were summarized, about 100 across the value chain of the drug development. And we have summarized here, for example, this is a snapshot where you have the type of application, for example, risk-benefit analysis or dose and schedule selection, which phase it is in the drug discovery and development value chain, which theme it is, whether it's based on PK or risk-benefit or efficacy. Is it a compound-related activity or disease-related activity? And what modeling approach has been used? Together with a formulation of the key question that we think was addressed in that specific publication. And there's also a link to the citation. But also, I think what is of interest to look at, so the EMA and the FPA impact categorization for those examples. And what you will see is that quite often they may agree, but at some places you also, it may not agree, because some of the decisions that are high impact for the industry will never come to the regulatory decision making, for example, by having a go, no-go decision, or the other way around, where it's very important for the regulator to make a decision about an extrapolation, whereas that may not be as important for the drug company itself. As a follow-up from that, there has been a quantitative pharmacology influence and impact initiative that was launched at ASCPT this year in March, where we have collated a crowdsourced compendium of 37 case studies in a number of different application areas. And ASCPT members have been providing a one-slide summary of impact of quantitative pharmacology or modeling and simulation in the area of translational medicine, drug development decision-making, regulatory decision-making, therapeutic use, and special populations, as well as in the cost effectiveness and differentiation area. And those were actually very nicely distributed across those application areas. And in the material, you will find a link to that slide repository. And everybody is able to use that as inspiration or as for educational purposes. But what we learned from those examples, and that is maybe of interest to discuss, is that with respect of the modeling approaches that were used in those case studies, is that about half of the case studies were using empirical models, while the other half were using more novel methodologies, like model-based meta-analysis, mechanistic approaches, and systems pharmacology and PBPK. Also, the more examples about how to use modeling and simulation during therapeutic use. And that's for example, selecting the right dose in the pediatric or other populations, but also assessing how to differentiate. And with respect of the MID3 level, whether it's compound, mechanism, or disease related, we see that 75% focuses still on the compound. And with respect of impact, most of the examples were medium, but there were also about 35% examples that were illustrating analyses that were replacing the experimental evidence. So that has been a tremendous uptake in sharing. The last part of the summary will be about the planning, the conduct, and the documentation of MID3. And good practice is obviously a lot of common sense, clarity, so providing clarity on the key question and the objectives for the analysis, being able to be transparent on the assumptions and how you address or evaluate the assumptions. How do you simulate the uncertainty? And also, it needs to be reproducible. So where is your, can you trace it back to the original data set and what was done in order to arrive at the final model? There should be, of course, enough information so other people will be able to judge the model. And you would need to have a documentation with respect of the key stakeholders, not only your peer modelers, but as well the decision makers. And obviously we have a proposal on what would you include in the analysis simulation and the reporting documentations. And that doesn't overrule any of the specific guidelines, such as the PIP or the PVPK guidelines. One key thing is that we have proposed to create an assumption table to categorize the different types of assumptions. And in this way, we hope that the discussion about assumption will go away from the equations, but more towards the assumption itself. And in such a way, being able to address how do we assess the assumptions, so we move from the red into the green area. And I'll illustrate that, which is also illustrated in table 5 in the white paper, where, for example, a pharmacological assumption, whether you would use an Emax model to describe an dose or exposure response relationship compared to a linear model. Sometimes you may have, and especially in the pharmacometrics domain, Emax models are more often used than in the statistical domain, but you are able to make that assumption and being able to test that. But there are also physiological assumptions or disease assumptions that you may want to have a dialogue with the physician or the biologist in the project team, whereas the mathematical assumptions or the data assumptions are in another category where you have a potential other way of evaluating those. But having those together and being able to address that within the team and the stakeholders to have the appropriate dialogue will aid the transparency of your analysis. Interestingly, while we were publishing the good practice paper from the pharmacometrics community, the statisticians in the pharmaceutical industry in Europe also worked on a good practice paper. And if we compare those two best practice papers, we see that the basic standards in planning and reporting, they are quite in alignment. The focus may be slightly different and more practical in the statistical paper, as well as more the thinking in the model-informed drug discovery and development with respect of compound, mechanism, and disease is more pronounced in the FPIA paper. But we have had a number of interactions at the statistical and pharmacometrics meetings, and we are moving towards together to see if there's any opportunity to get a better that we will be working towards a single good practice or best practice. So in summary, it is important to think about at a strategic level for each program in the disease areas, what are the key questions? In which themes do they fall? Is it at the disease, compound, or mechanistic level? While addressing those questions, what assumptions will be made and what level are those in order to be able to discuss that? Which models will you be using and how do you actually use those models in the appropriate way with the level of qualification? And that may actually be dependent on the impact level of the work that you will be doing. Is that low, medium, or high impact? And being able to document that in a transparent way will increase the acceptance and the use of the activities that are done. So what have we done since the release of the white paper? We have been sharing that at multiple meetings, both in the pharmacometrics domain as well as in the statistical domain. We also have been out to the Asian population in Japan and China. And there have been a number of WebExes in different formats be released. We have had dialogues with both the EMA and the FDA, and there have been a number of workshops on both the extrapolation and the exposure response modeling, where we have been providing our input. And most recently, pharma has initiated a model-informed drug development, strategic development in support of PDUFA 6. Those discussions are ongoing. And we'll continue with having dialogues with the regulators with the ultimate aim to make sure that we increase our good practices and we'll have a clear idea about how we can best serve both the companies and the regulatory decision makers. So with that, I would like to end and point you to the different references for the MID3 paper, as well as the Impact and Influence Initiative from the ASCPT, and also invite you to join us at ACOP, where Kevin Dijkstra and myself will chair a symposium session on model-informed drug discovery and development, where Scott Marshall, as well as the FDA and the EMA, will be discussing good practice, the regulatory expectations, and the technical gaps. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.